Hey, Tyler here. Nehru asked me to warn you about this video. Please watch the full disclaimer before deciding whether you want to watch it. This video is about body horror, and resultantly uses a liberal amount of examples from horror films, so there's a lot of gore and a variety of kinds. You have been warned. However, Nehru wants everybody to be able to enjoy the video, so if you are sensitive to that sort of thing, check the description for a link to an unlisted version with all the gory scenes removed. Now, onto the video.
If mind is our only reality, there is no proof that everything is not a hallucination, even the body itself. It is certainly an unstable reality, subject as it is to sudden mutilation or gradual mutation. The body is so fluid and so impermanent that nothing in our existence, other than death, can be relied upon. The absurd horror of our fleshly destiny can indeed be transmuted into nourishing fantasy. Because we are all conscious of the inevitability of death, because we know that we will inevitably suffer somehow while we are alive, horror films provide us with a magic mirror that reflects our anxieties back at ourselves.
The Legend of Zelda is not a horror series. It is ostensibly a lighthearted series of retellings of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, with a different setting and usually a different cast of characters every time. And yet The Legend of Zelda can be scary, it can be horrific. This is obvious from even a cursory look into the things in Zelda that make memories and inspire fanworks. For as much flack as the Shadow Temple gets for its linear design, it's also firmly planted in people's heads. The speaking wall portraits, the skeleton piles, the torture devices, a literal ferry ride across a deathly river. The Shadow Temple has a spooky and enduring reputation, as do many other aspects of The Legend of Zelda. The thing is, most adventure games eventually explore horror-themed plot threads, levels, and areas like the Shadow Temple. And while they are generally enjoyable diversions, they don't leave a mark in the same way the scary moments in Zelda do. Why is that? Well, I think it's because of how expertly the Zelda games utilize the strengths of different genres of horror. Quite often, adventure games will utilize horror motifs for a conceptual, or sometimes literal, haunted house area or level. The horror is just window dressing, it isn't meant to be anything substantial. But when it comes to Zelda, the genres of horror being pulled from are thoroughly understood and expertly conveyed. So even if it is used to convey just a minor feeling of fear or unease or dread, that feeling sticks with you, however fleeting it might have been in-game. The Legend of Zelda skillfully utilizes many different horror subgenres and concepts throughout the series. The existential dread and cosmic futility of the 3-day cycle in Majora's Mask, the art horror inspirations for Twilight Princess's interloper scene, and the borderline occultic vibes of the Shadow Temple. These are all expertly realized, but they aren't what I'd like to talk about today. Instead, I'd like to talk about the body horror of The Legend of Zelda. To make sure we're all on the same page, I think we need a common definition of body horror. It is of course a film genre. I really like Wikipedia's definition. Body horror, or biological horror, is a subgenre of horror that intentionally showcases graphic or psychologically disturbing violations of the human body. These violations may manifest through aberrant sex, mutations, mutilations, zombification, gratuitous violence, disease, or unnatural movements of the body. That first line is it in a nutshell, I think. Body horror is essentially that which intentionally showcases graphic or psychologically disturbing violations of the human body. This is a broad definition, and rightfully so. Body horror is a technique that can be used in films, utilized to perfection in John Carpenter's The Thing and Ridley Scott's Alien, but it can also stand as its own genre, with masterpieces like Cronenberg's The Fly identifying specifically as a body horror film. And of course, it isn't just a film technique. Body horror can be utilized by all sorts of mediums. The best anime film of all time, Akira, the incredible works of Junji Ito. It has been posthumously applied to some of Lovecraft's work, and of course, video games. Video games absolutely love body horror, and The Legend of Zelda is no stranger to the use of body horror. Since Ocarina of Time, the series has utilized grotesque perversions of the human form to chill its younger players. There are, of course, the obvious examples you'll immediately jump to. The zombie-like, decaying ReDead, the horrific Dead Hand with its twisted face and human teeth, Bongo Bongo and his severed hands. These are all examples of body horror within the Legend of Zelda franchise, and we will talk about those. But I also think that some of the best body horror in Zelda is also some of the most understated. It has to be said though, not all body horror is created equal. It is very obvious when body horror is used purely for the shock value and when it's used to say something meaningful. Body horror can serve the dual purpose of being horrific while also functioning as a rhetorical device to advance the themes of the story. The zombies and monsters in Resident Evil are largely in the game for the spook factor, whereas each monster in Silent Hill is designed for a narrative purpose, and the aspect of body horror that they represent says something about the world of Silent Hill and the protagonist of the game. And this is the most important part of body horror in The Legend of Zelda. The majority of it is frightening on its own terms, while also being meaningful. Body horror exists in some form in every 3D Zelda game, but in this video I'd like to narrow the discussion and talk about the two games that I think most effectively utilize body horror, not only to offer some genuine scares and feelings of unease, but also to enhance the meaning and themes of the game. Today, we'll be talking about body horror as seen in the N64 games, Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. Author David Huckvale published a book in the latter half of 2020 called Terrors of the Flesh: Philosophy of Body Horror in Film. And while the book itself is an enjoyable read, it's his breakdown of body horror into categories that is particularly useful for this video. We won't use every category, but we will be following his structure. And with that, let's get started.
If we have a horror of eating other people, we are even more distressed by the thought of actually being eaten ourselves, and the imagery of ingestion is a recurrent preoccupation in horror.
Ocarina of Time is essentially a game about growing up. Some things are just out of your control as a child, and you can do nothing but wait until you grow into yourself and become a person capable of dealing with them. As children, Link and Zelda conspire to defeat Ganondorf and stop him from taking power, but they fail because they weren't ready. It takes a 7-year coma for Link, and extensive training as a Sheikah for Zelda for them to be ready to finally face Ganondorf. When you're growing up, your biggest fear is often related to not being able to grow up. I think most of us remembered wanting nothing more than to be grown-ups when we were little kids. As children, we often feel powerless, like our bodily autonomy is not our own. Adults make decisions about our bodies and well-being for us, sometimes making decisions we don't agree with. But as we grow up, we assert more control over ourselves and gain more autonomy over our bodies. This is why Link left Kokiri Village to begin with. There was no more growing up to be had there. If Link did want to grow up and become stronger and gain more autonomy over his body, it had to be done away from home. But what is scarier than the idea of never growing up is having the ability to grow up taken away from you. To have your future potential and your personhood consumed, devoured, dissolved, and eradicated. This is a magical video game. Death by old age or sickness is hardly the end. Death by consummation is a very definitive end. And that's why I think Ocarina of Time relies so heavily on the oral consumption of Child Link. Have you ever noticed the sheer amount of times Child Link enters the mouth of a large sentient or once sentient creature? All 3 child dungeons see Link metaphorically, or in Jabu Jabu's case quite literally, swallowed into a place of darkness. And this makes sense. Link is undergoing a hero's journey, and part of the hero's journey is the hero facing their fears. So if a primary fear for Child Link is the consumption of his hopes for adulthood before he can grow up, then his entering into these cursed dungeons through the mouth of a sentient being serves to show growth. Being ingested means to risk having your life ended as a child, to lose the chance to grow up, yet Link willingly enters the mouths of these giant creatures. When he exits the mouths, it is triumphantly and with his childhood and personhood still intact. Where the true horror comes from, then, is the idea of Link failing to escape oral consumption. The most obvious and effective examples of this are the encounters with the ReDead and the fights against Dead Hand. On a subconscious level, this is why the ReDead restraining Link and devouring him is something so fearful. Even though the interesting animation of the ReDead restraining and eating Link can bring some levity, at the end of the day it still horrifies us. And that goes almost doubly for the initial fight against the Dead Hand, which will be talked about a lot in this video because he's just one gigantic blob of many different facets of body horror. But in this case, the Dead Hand's horror comes from his obvious intent to consume Child Link. The boss battle revolves around baiting him close and hitting him at the last minute. It's as if in order to defeat the Dead Hand, Link has to acknowledge how frail his childhood and his life is, and how easily these things could be taken away from him as his body and soul are consumed by this hideous blood-stained monster. Once he accepts this truth and embraces the fear that comes with it, he's able to strike back and fight to hold on to the right to grow up. This is why when you run into the Dead Hand again in the Shadow Temple as an adult, it isn't nearly as scary. Sure, the fact that it isn't your first encounter with him anymore has something to do with it, but I don't think it's the entire case. After all, meeting the Dead Hand in the bottom of the well continues to unnerve me during additional playthroughs. No, the reason that facing the Dead Hand as an adult isn't scary is because there's less at stake. Link is an adult in his prime. There's no more waiting or getting stronger. If Link isn't capable of beating this Dead Hand now, he'll never be capable. Fighting the Dead Hand as an adult seems like something unfair. The Dead Hand to the hero of time is just another mini-boss. Not to mention that it's a lot harder to imagine adult Link being consumed by the Dead Hand. Even looking at the bite animations, when Child Link is chomped, it looks like the Dead Hand could rather easily bite most of him in one go. When Dead Hand bites adult Link, it seems more similar in scope to an animal bite. Getting eaten by the Dead Hand and the ReDead is scary for Child Link because to a child, the most important thing is the future, whereas to an adult, the most important thing is the present. This is why the encounter with the second Dead Hand isn't nearly as frightening. He serves more as character development to show how far Link has come as he grows into adulthood. The Dead Hand is horrific to look at, yes, but more horrific is the thought of Link being devoured by his bloody maw. The Dead Hand's stomach acid melting away Link's physical body, as well as the potential for his childhood. As they say, he had so much life ahead of him.
Dismemberment is a worse horror than death itself, because the physical horror of dismemberment is the gateway of an even more profound existential horror, that of identity. If we are no more than the sum of our parts, where does our centre lie? Do we have a centre? If we can be dismembered or physically altered, we would appear to have no reliable reality other than that which a belief in the soul would bring. If we no longer believe in the soul, all we have is a body, which is transient, subject to injury or altercation by accident or malevolence.
I think of Mutilation as a sort of go-to type of body horror. I bet if I tasked you with thinking of scares in games, movies, and other medias that involved beheadings, severed limbs, torn up bodies, gouged eyes, and the like, you'd be able to think of a half dozen off the top of your head. In addition to being unsightly and gruesome, Mutilation hits us on an existential level. For better or worse, we value wholeness and completion in our bodies. A sound body is a sound mind, and the act of losing a piece of your body can feel devastating. For a really mild example, think of how awful it feels to have your shield devoured by a like. It feels wrong, doesn't it? Not scary at all, just unpleasant. Like, obviously it sucks that your primary method of defense is gone, but there's something more to it, isn't there? It feels gross. It feels like a violation. The like didn't just eat your shield, it took part of your essence with it, however small a part it might be, and you're eager to reclaim it. Now imagine this applied to a limb, or a digit, or your eyes, or any other vulnerable part of your body, but with the inability to reclaim that which is lost. You can't get your severed hand back the same way you could get back your shield. The devastation that comes with the loss of a valuable part of our body is profound, and our apprehension and eagerness to avoid that devastation is where the horror comes from. In all of The Legend of Zelda, the horror of mutilation is never conveyed better than by the Shadow Temple. The Shadow Temple, located in the Kakariko Village graveyard. It is a place where the Sheikah, entrusted with the lives of Hyrule's royal family, have historically taken enemies of the royal family to be interrogated, or worse. Because it stands as a symbol of Hyrule's dark history, it is taboo for the royal family to speak of this temple and its horrific purpose. Here is gathered Hyrule's bloody history of greed and hatred. Analytically, the Shadow Temple has a lot going on. The complicated and dark place it serves in the lore of Ocarina of Time, the way it metaphorically serves as a descent into the afterlife as the temple begins at the graveyard where the dead are buried, before making a non-stop descent to a quite literal ferry of the dead. But those are all concepts for another time. Right now we want to examine why and how the Shadow Temple uses the concept of mutilation to convey its horrific themes. The Shadow Temple serves as torture and execution grounds for the Sheikah, and evidence is everywhere you look. Torture devices, piles of bodies, cages, it really wears its purpose on its sleeve. Mutilation scares us in a different way than being consumed, because while both revolve around harm befalling us immediately and against our will, mutilation signifies the gradual destruction of our body. And we see our body as irrevocably interlinked with our humanity. If we are no more than the sum of our parts, where does our center lie? Think of the legend of Sleepy Hollow. It isn't the fact that the Headless Horseman is a ghost that is most notable about him, is it? It's the fact that he's headless. Why is that? Being headless is something based in reality, whereas being a ghost is something ethereal and otherworldly. Yet it's his headlessness that's the most notable, and to many the scariest thing about him. It's the visible destruction of his body which is scariest. The thought of somebody without a head continuing to live is, to many, a primally scarier notion than the thought of a ghost continuing to exist after death. The theme of mutilation through torture and execution exists throughout the Shadow Temple, particularly mutilation through dismemberment. Signs of dismemberment are everywhere. Blades can be seen all over the place. Guillotines big enough to slice a human in half entirely. The giant Reaper statues that swing their blades through the air in a circular fashion, bisecting anyone unlucky enough to be in their way. Even the fans, which could have absolutely gotten away with being regular-looking fans, look like blades that yearn to rend flesh. What furthers this motif is the grim decor. In many places, the walls are adorned with skulls and talking faces, none of which are attached to bodies. It's like the dungeon itself is telling you that your chances of making it out of here in one piece, physically or spiritually, are slim. And this theme of dismemberment continues when considering the denizens of the Shadow Temple. There's some really interesting theming going on with the monsters in the Shadow Temple. There's a heavy emphasis on, of all things, dismembered hands. And this time it isn't implied, it's fairly graphic. Let's take another look at the Dead Hand. Note the name, Dead Hand. He sort of hits this on two layers. The Dead Hand himself consists of more or less two parts. There's his body, and then of course there are the hands that sprout out of the ground all around him. As established, the Dead Hand is horrific in general, in every single aspect. There's nothing pleasant about him, and that includes the fact that his hands were chopped off. I know a lot of artwork by fans convey these little stumps as blades, but I think they're very obviously arms with the hands severed into stumps. This makes thematic sense with the dungeon, but also internally. The hands on his physical body were chopped off, so he reaches out to his victim with the hands all around him. This works towards the theme of the dungeon. How do you kill the Dead Hand? Well, like we mentioned earlier, the common way is to have him emerge from the ground by letting him grab you, and then freeing yourself and attacking at the last minute. But there's another way to draw the dead hand out, and if you got okay grades in literary analysis class, you've probably guessed it. You can draw out the dead hand by chopping off his hands, by mutilating the dead hand. The idea of dismembered hands wouldn't be a motif if it was just the dead hand, though. Take the Floor Master. It looks quite literally like a detached, possibly severed hand, and you encounter it a few times throughout the Shadow Temple. But in the same way that Goma and King Dodongo have smaller versions of themselves in their respective dungeons, the Floor Master almost seems like it serves as reference to the boss of the Shadow Temple, Bongo Bongo, who is, you guessed it, a gigantic creature with severed hands. Like the Dead Hand, he has amputated arms with hands that float elsewhere. The idea that Bongo Bongo's hands were severed by a blade doesn't seem implied. It feels quite literal. You can see his stitches and exposed flesh, and it looks awful. So this theme of dismembered hands fits in the framework of the general theme of dismemberment in the Shadow Temple at large. The Shadow Temple was a place where enemies of Hyrule were brought to be tortured for information, to involuntarily give up a part of themselves. The Shadow Temple is a place in which if you visit it and are lucky enough to leave it alive, you probably won't be in one piece. You will experience a form of dismemberment, whether in a literal sense or more metaphorically, and you will lose a part of yourself. The Shadow Temple is then posited as a trial of fear for Link in his journey. It isn't the first time that he's encountered depravity and horror. The bottom of the well provided that. But Link's descent through the Shadow Temple serves more as a test of his courage. The Shadow Temple is a place in which once you enter, you are likely to not return without some form of mutilation. Whereas the bottom of the well is scary because of the contrast between the environment of the dungeon and the small child navigating through it. The Shadow Temple is scary because despite the fact that Link is a full-grown adult, at this point well over halfway through his journey, it still seems possible or even likely that the oppressive violence of the Shadow Temple may require Link to leave a piece of himself behind. It seems as if many people without the blessing of the Triforce of Courage ended up doing just that in the depraved mutilations that took place in the Shadow Temple. The fear of infection is simultaneously the oldest and most currently relevant fear we explore as humans. You can turn on the news, open social media, or just go outside right now in the year of 2021 and see humanity grapple with the anxieties that come with infection. But we've been writing about infection for about as long as we've been writing. Think of the Egyptian biblical plagues or the Mesopotamian god Nergal. Humanity has had fears of infection and disease for essentially as long as we've had fears. Like most things we're afraid of, our fear of infection stems from our fear of something harmful befalling us against our will. Whereas the fear of being consumed or mutilated explores harm being inflicted upon us by some external force, infection sees us suffer harm from inside our own bodies. Being consumed by a monster or mutilated by a demented torturer are both obviously horrific, but those are external forces, something that can be fought against, resisted, or ran away from. An infection in our own body is frightening on a fundamental level. The infection may have come from an external force, but there's no monster to run from or captor to reason with, only the rapid worsening of our own bodies. In horror, this is well-trodden ground, with everything from vampirism and lycanthropy to zombie outbreaks and grotesque illness. Infection is explored perhaps less frequently in video games, but the psychology of infection is masterfully explored in Silent Hill 2, and of course I naturally would not be mentioning it if infection wasn't utilized so effectively in The Legend of Zelda. Infection can be found throughout Zelda in numerous forms. From the nightmares of the Windfish to the essentially diseased Twilight, infection plays many roles. Ocarina of Time uses infection to set up meaningfully unsettling atmospheres that may not be outright horrific, but undoubtedly stick with you. In Ganondorf's quest to conquer Hyrule and bend the races to his will, he infects the Great Deku Tree and Lord Jabu Jabu with parasites. The way this is conveyed by each of them is different. The Deku Tree imparts a sense of rot and degradation, similar to a disease like leprosy, whereas Jabu Jabu shows a more internal infection closer to a cancer, with off-colored blood and tumor-like growths. And this is visually distinct in both of them, in that all too familiar form of mild, child-friendly terror that has a way of searing itself in our brains. Watching the Deku Tree die in front of me, seeing the color and vibrancy leave his body as he withers and fades away, unable to do anything more for him, that deeply disturbed me as a kid, and it stuck with me for a long time. Even now, when I replay Ocarina of Time, that scene affects me. It has transformed into a sort of sadness as opposed to a sense of horror, like watching a friend die, but I still find it to be an affecting scene, particularly because of Link's helplessness. He can and does save the world, but he cannot save the father figure that spent so much time protecting him, because that is the nature of infection, and that helplessness is the driving factor of what makes infection so scary. A monster can be beat, and indeed Link fulfills that aspect of the task. He kills Goma and all of her children. But an infection can't be stopped through sheer bravery. The Triforce of Courage and Link's tremendous combat ability are useless when it comes to helping the Deku Tree survive the late stages of a disease. All that's left behind is the withered husk of a dead tree where a protector and father figure had once been. In the case of Jabu Jabu, the infection is caught early enough that Link can go into him and kill the monster causing it, and thus he is able to save Jabu Jabu's life, whereas the Deku Tree was too far along. Yet still, Jabu Jabu's belly is a dungeon that is notorious for making people feel uneasy and gross, and it makes total sense why. Tromping around his stomach and seeing his stomach lining, internal organs, and fleshy bits is inherently disturbing. Seeing his whole body quiver and pulse is deeply unnerving because we are predisposed to the notion that if we're seeing the internal organs, the flesh and bones of a creature, it either means we're eating them or something is tragically wrong. Our brain and heart and organs belong inside our body, and to see them with our own eyes has historically meant that we don't have long to live. That is why for most of us, seeing a surgery performed is something that we're likely to look away from, even if it's something banal, like a plastic surgery operation with no real risk. The act of seeing a body be cut open and peering at the squishy pinks and reds inside is enough to cause extreme discomfort to the majority of us. Even in medical schools, where future surgeons are trained, this fear persists. In a 2009 study, of the 630 clinical students who were studied while observing a surgery, 77 of them fainted or came close to it. The fear of our own internals is primal. It's something we hardly have control over. While it certainly affects different people differently, it is something that is coded into our DNA. As Professor of Neuroscience Joseph Ledoux puts it, one of the reasons we're afraid of heights is because our ancestors lived in trees, and falling out of a tree could be dangerous. Seeing blood obviously reflects something bad happening around you. Or, to quote David Huckvale's more direct wording about why seeing a brain is so disturbing to us, it is revolting, of course, because if we can see it, it is fatally misplaced. And this is why Jabu Jabu's belly is so notoriously unsettling, because we aren't just seeing vulnerable flesh and vital organs when we probably shouldn't be, but we're inhabiting them. We have to engage with these organs, and in some case harm and even sever them to advance. When we shoot a switch in a dungeon to open a door, it doesn't have any impact on us at all. Why would it? We're just engaging with the mechanics of a door. But when we shoot the white switch at the top of Jabu Jabu, we know we aren't just hitting a switch. We're triggering a bodily function, probably through the stimulus of pain. But again, we're traversing through the internals of the great Jabu Jabu, subjecting ourselves to this discomfort to help Jabu Jabu deal with his infection. Visually, this is rendered in very unpleasant forms. We can see the infection visibly all throughout his body. We see it in the parasitic monsters that roam freely through his intestines. We see it in the agonizing blue throbbing veins that line the walls of his throat, in the sickly green that certain areas of his organs have turned. We see it via the large swinging parasites that feast on his body. From a gameplay perspective, these parasites cause certain doors to stay locked until they're defeated, but it seems to imply that the parasites are causing Jabu Jabu enough pain that parts of him tense up and don't relax until the pain is relieved. And of course, at the deepest parts of Jabu Jabu, we find Baronade, the electric rotating intestinal worm. Baronade looks like a tumorous mass, a bulbous clump of parasitic tendrils. When he clasps onto Jabu Jabu, you'll notice that the parts of Jabu Jabu's flesh being pierced by Baronade's tentacles are a noticeably sicklier shade of green. It's hard not to think about the immense pain that must be caused to Jabu Jabu when the creature burrows and latches. When Link finally defeats him, we're treated to a rather horrific death scene, as he begins to rapidly suffer growths all across his body, before exploding into foul, revolting chunks, in a scene shockingly gory for a game with an E rating. Baronade himself faced a death that seems to parallel what would have been the inevitable fate of Jabu Jabu. When thinking of horror in The Legend of Zelda, the infection of the Deku Tree and Jabu Jabu are likely far from the first to come to mind. Certainly not comparable to the likes of Dead Hand and the ReDead. And yet sometimes the most effective use of horror is not to outright scare you, but only to utilize feelings of discomfort. And I think the use of infection is a masterwork in the haunting degradation of the Deku Tree, followed by witnessing the infection of Jabu Jabu from the inside, serves as examples of excellent, restrained use of infection as body horror. Thus far, we've mostly spoken about forms of body horror that involve the degradation of your body in some form, be it through the destruction of your body through mutilation, or the sickening of it through infection. Mutation, on the other hand, refers to the changing of your body. This change is usually involuntary, and like much of the horror we've discussed, that unwillingness is where the fear of mutation comes from. We consider our bodies to be something sacred, and like we mentioned in regards to mutilation and infection, we have a lot of insecurities related to something going wrong or causing harm to our body. Mutation, then, serves as the direct realization of that fear. Our body changes from the form we recognize and consider to be whole into something we don't recognize, and the act of that transformation can be terrifying. The Legend of Zelda utilizes mutation as a source of discomfort with some frequency, but I think nowhere in the series is it utilized more effectively than in Majora's Mask. The idea of mutation infects every corner of the game, and I think a lot of the underlying layers of uneasiness that people feel from Majora's Mask comes from the incredible use of mutation. Majora's Mask is often regarded as the spookiest Zelda game, but on the surface this seems pretty odd. In terms of pure visual body horror, it actually seems like a big step down from Ocarina of Time's rather visceral portrayals of the corrupted and damaged body. There are no monsters in Majora's Mask that come even close to being as fearsome as the Dead Hand, and even the ReDead are made into more of comic relief in Majora's Mask. There's nothing as environmentally disturbing as the Shadow Temple. Icona Canyon comes the closest, and it's far closer to a playful gothic horror than to the depravity of the torture devices in the depths of Kakariko. So why then is Majora's Mask generally considered to be such a creepy game? I believe that it's because of its successful use of psychological horror, which has the benefit of skipping past the fourth wall and scaring or unsettling you personally. The things you see in Majora's Mask don't make you worry for Link's safety in the same way the Dead Hand does. It instead takes on an emotional angle and affects you directly. And to be clear, Majora's Mask doesn't rely on anything outwardly terrifying to create its feeling of unease. The closest thing would probably be the face on the moon. Instead, Majora's Mask relies on near relentless barrages of moments that feel just a little bit off to keep an oppressive and uncomfortable atmosphere. Even in the most idyllic and unassuming locations in Termina, you still always have the feeling that something is wrong, that there's a terror lurking just under the surface. I think one of the ways through which Majora's Mask is so effective at creating these feelings of discomfort is through the use of mutation as a primary plot device. Mutation inhibits nearly every aspect of Majora's Mask and serves to establish a fearsome tone. Body horror is a spectrum. and can be utilized in varying degrees of intensity. Very little of the body horror in Majora's Mask is visceral or disturbing, but there is one instance in which the mutation of a body is visually uncomfortable, and that's through Pamela's father. He is cursed, destined to slowly become a Gibdo, and as we meet him, the curse is about halfway to completion. The father's Gibdo form is disturbing to look at, but more disturbing are his movements and the remnants of a personality left within him. The way he stumbles forward towards you, imitating human movement while obviously not being human, is so uncomfortable to look at. Zombies have been a common part of the lexicon of horror for longer than most of us have been alive, and there are many reasons why they terrify us so much. One of them is, of course, the uncanny valley. To quote Frank McAndrew of Philosophy Today, as an inanimate object comes to look and act more like an actual human being, it usually becomes more attractive to us. That is, until it becomes almost exactly like a human, but not quite. Things that reach this level of proximity to humanness often prompt feelings of revulsion rather than attraction. He goes on to say that the uncanny valley can explain our squeamishness about corpses, just like a normal human, except not alive, as well as the fascination that we have with zombies. Unlike many of the other monsters that haunt our imaginations, zombies were once normal human beings. A traumatic event, usually being bitten by a zombie, has somehow transformed them into something eerily human and dangerously not human. Zombies may even maintain their identity as the distinct individual humans that they were in their previous life, making them all the more creepy and sinister. I think that is why seeing Pamela's father is so creepy, far creepier than the Gibdo that surround his house. Logically, the Gibdo outside should be creepier as they're fully dead and genuinely want to hurt us, but it's the harmless half Gibdo that does end up being the creepiest, and that's because he gets far closer to the uncanny valley than regular Gibdo. He's still distinctively human looking, and yet his body is perverted, not whole. We see human emotion in his face, but he trudges towards us like an animal. Seeing his face makes us expect human-like behavior, but we don't get that outside of little moments. His existence just feels wrong. Human-shaped, but not human in behavior. A horrible mutation. Pamela's father is definitely the most visually unsettling aspect of Mutation in Majora's Mask, but not the most effective example. He is a small part of the game, a side quest, a diversion. The area in which Mutation is most effectively unsettling is in the primary plot device of the game, the masks. It may shock you to learn that Majora's Mask revolves around masks, and there could be an entire video dedicated to why the focus on masks allows for such strong theming, but we are focused specifically on how the masks and the body interact, create a unique brand of horror. The physical masks themselves serve to elicit fear. They sit in your inventory, unblinking. Link obtains the transformation masks from a loss of life. Each mask came from an individual, somebody with a life, and people who cared about them before their tragic death. For each mask, we meet the victims at several different stages of death. We meet Mikau as he's still alive, being privy to his final words and seeing to his burial. With Darmani, we meet him after he's passed, but before his spirit has dissipated. We converse with his spirit and ultimately put it to rest. And of course, with the Deku Scrub from which Link gets the Deku Mask, we meet him after he has passed away and his spirit has dissipated, leaving only a corpse. These masks contain parts of their essence, which is what allows the transformation to take place. The masks themselves, then, aren't merely facsimiles of the races they represent, rather they are the pieces of the individual they were once a part of. And that makes the fact that they look like severed heads rather disturbing. They exist as some form of alive, but only their heads, which Link carries around like some sort of executioner. This obviously isn't true. We know they are masks and not heads, but the symbolism is no less disturbing. A particularly powerful instance of mutation occurs in the very start of the game, when Link is turned into a Deku Scrub by Majora. A hellish sequence follows in which Link is swarmed and chased by Deku Scrubs before fleeing from a massive Deku. It is no surprise that this scene has a measure of terror about it, as it spawned from a nightmare that Aonuma had. After the transformation, the once Hylian Link is no more, and in his place is a Deku scrub. And as Link looks into the water and discovers his new form, feelings of body dysmorphia set in, and all he can do is scream. The actual transformations are frightful as well. The Zelda team made a deliberate choice when it came to the transformation masks. Let's look at a full body transformation in another Nintendo franchise, Mario. When Toadette picks up the Super Crown, she transforms into Peachette by spinning and glowing, ending in a cheer. It seems like a rather pleasant process. Now let's look at another transformation, this time within the Zelda series. Let's examine Link's transformation into his wolf form in Twilight Princess. The first time it happens, and we see the full transformation, it does look like there is some discomfort and maybe even pain, but most of it seems to stem from the fact that Link doesn't really understand what is happening to him, and less from pain stemming from the actual transformation itself. And in fact, from that point on, Link can transform to and from wolf form seamlessly, with no pain at all. Now, let's watch what happens when Link transforms in Majora's Mask. The act of transforming in Majora's Mask seems to be agonizing, far more similar to An American Werewolf in London than to Buffy. Link puts the mask on and stands still for just a moment before bending forward and gripping his face in pain. Then the pain overwhelms him, and all he can do is throw his head back and scream. Look at this face. Look at the eyes, the bulging veins in them. Look at the expression on the Goron mask's face. Look at how wide his mouth is. Transforming into another being in the world of Majora's Mask is terrifying. And this makes sense. Transforming from one size to another should be a painful, terrifying thing. Your bones are growing or shrinking, stretching muscles and relocating organs. Mutation is scary because of the change of our body, which we consider to be sacred, into something unfamiliar, something dysmorphic, something painful. Of course, it wouldn't be right for me to make a video focusing on body horror in The Legend of Zelda, particularly honing in on Majora's Mask, and not mention the Elegy statues. These haunted visages, particularly the one with Link's likeliness, have served to curse the nightmares of kids for a long time, and Link's Elegy statue in particular has gained a lot of fame thanks to the most famous video game creepypasta of all time, Ben Drowned. For those who are a fan of that story, the face of the Elegy statue is burned into your memory. The Elegy statues take the shape of a lifeless representation of whatever form Link is in when he creates it. There is something peculiar about the statues left behind, though. The Elegy statues created by transformations have soulless, dead eyes. The exception is the statue left by the Deku scrub, but that's likely because Deku eyes are always red. But both the Goron and the Zora statues have blank, pupilless eyes. Totally lifeless. Yet the statue that Link in his Hylian form leaves behind is distinctively not blank. It stares forward with an unsettling expression that reminds me a bit of the Mona Lisa, in the sense that explaining exactly what emotion is being expressed is up for interpretation. At one moment I see a sort of sadistic smile, at another point I see extreme discomfort. But whatever the emotion I interpret when I look at the Elegy statue, it's chilling to me all the same. It is tough to pin down what exactly is so horrific about the Elegy statue. Certainly there's an element of the uncanny valley to it. The statue definitely looks close enough to Link, but not quite there in a way that's unsettling. But there's something else to it, isn't there? Something that lingers in your mind when you stare at this thing's face. Have you ever stared at yourself in a mirror? Not just a quick peek, I mean really stared at yourself. If you have, you might have felt some feelings of discomfort. If you keep staring, those feelings might go away. But for some people, they don't go away. In fact, they may get worse. Staring in a mirror might cause you some genuine fear. To some of you, it may seem like an odd thing to be fearful of, but there's a long history of terrors related to seeing your own reflection. In fact, we have two separate reflection-related diagnosed phobias. Isotropophobia is the fear of seeing your own image in the mirror, whereas spectrophobia is fear of not necessarily seeing yourself in the mirror, but a fear of the reflection itself. A fear that something disturbing might happen in the reflection, or that the reflection might even harm you somehow. Isotropophobia is a fear of what you know you'll see, an image of yourself, whereas spectrophobia is a fear of seeing something that you don't expect, namely, anything other than just yourself. I bring this up because this is what I think explains the discomfort we feel with the Elegy statue. To stare at the Elegy statue is to stare at a mirror, but instead of your reflection greeting you, it's a twisted form. We've talked many times in this video about how body horror predicates itself on the fear that comes from your body being in a state that it isn't meant to be in. And while the Elegy statue isn't missing a body part or covered in tumors, it is undeniably an incorrect configuration. In an interview for the movie Us, which is a movie wholly focused on doppelgangers, Jordan Peele talks about the primal fear that people have for doppelgangers. He says, "It makes you question your identity. You know, the one thing we can count on in our own consciousness is that it's ours, and this place in the universe is ours. The one thing that we can know for certain. And when that is put into question, it's just this existential crisis." Now, throughout history, the doppelganger mythology exists, and what I think it represents is everything that we don't face in ourselves. It is a representation of the guilt, the trauma, the fear, the hatred that might be buried underneath layers of pleasantry. All that stuff we don't deal with, when it comes out, it'll come out in crazy ways. And what Peele mentions here about doppelgangers throughout history is important in regards to the Elegy statue. It comes from a long and storied tradition of folklore. Particularly interesting is its history in German folklore, where the phenomenon gets its name. In German folklore, to see your doppelganger was a sign that death was near. Extending this back to Link makes the statue take on a new, more sinister angle. Remember, all of the other Elegy statues, those of dead people, are soulless and pupilless. The statue of Link, however, is not dead at all. It could be interpreted that this is his doppelganger, and a symbol that death was near for Link, that he too would soon be rendered into a soulless and pupilless state. Majora's Mask is a psychologically affecting game, and it is a masterclass in causing subtle fright. It is impressive that it is so often considered to be the scariest Zelda game, when so little of it is overtly disturbing. But through expert use of mutation as a theme, in many different forms, Majora's Mask is able to enforce its oppressive atmosphere and supply an experience that is endlessly creepy. And honestly, that applies to the N64 Zelda games as a whole. Both Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask make excellent use of body horror to establish a layer of fear that is a cut above the usual graveyard levels and mutated monsters of your average adventure game. The Dead Hand, the ReDead, the Shadow Temple, the transformation masks, these things have a way of standing out in a manner that most scary video game enemies do not. And I think that's because they are designed in a way to tell a story. Through use of mutilation, digestion, infection, and mutation, The Legend of Zelda is able to draw parallels and establish strong metaphors, and it results in moments that are both scary and enriching, rife with opportunity for analysis. And I sure did enjoy doing that today. This was a really long video, and if you made it to the end, I just want to thank you. If you liked this video essay style content where we focused less on the lore and more on analysis and symbolism, please let me know. I'd love to make more, though maybe a bit shorter next time. Thanks for watching. I hope your Halloween was and will be fantastic, and as always, stay safe out there. Be careful as you creep through the Shadow Temple, watch for guillotines, and for the love of Hylia, do not enter without your lens of truth, because it's dangerous to go alone.